He believed. You know, I sometimes get a bit depressed by reading books on answers to prayer. Do you? You read the life of George Muller and Hudson Taylor and you just want to crawl away and give up. I'm going to suggest this. Look, there are two things to do with your faith, two things not to do with it, and two things to do with it. Let's be practical. Here are the two things not to do with it. Don't try and feel your faith. I've already mentioned that, but don't try and feel your faith. Your feelings go up and down. If they didn't, you wouldn't have any. But if you tie your faith to your feelings, your faith will go up and down too. Tie your feelings to your faith, and then your feelings will follow your faith. Tie your faith to the facts. That's the right way round. So don't try and feel your faith, and above all, don't try and force your faith. You can read the life of George Muller and then try and force yourself to open a big orphanage. Forcing faith doesn't work. What do you do to your faith? I'll tell you. First, you stimulate it, then you stretch it. Stimulate your faith by listening to other answers to prayer. Can I give you one from a 14 or 15-year-old teenage boy in this congregation? He was on a school outing, and while traveling on the coach, he wanted to eat the orange that had been given him with his packed lunch. The problem was what to do with the orange peel. The ashtrays were all jammed full, and he didn't want to put it in his pocket. So what did he do? He prayed in faith and just asked God to deal with the problem. Another boy tapped him on the shoulder and said, "What are you going to do with that peel?" And he said, "Well, why do you ask?" "Well," he said, "I like eating it. Could I have it?" The boy who'd prayed, he may be here for all I know, deliberately went round the bus and asked every other boy, "Do you eat orange peel? Do you eat orange peel? Do you eat orange peel?" And got a resounding no from every other boy. All right. It's amusing. But to me it's encouraging. Tremendously. Because he just asked about a simple problem. And the Lord heard. The Lord put it right. That's all of a piece with the Lord who turned water into wine when they got into a little embarrassment at a wedding reception at Cana of Galilee. Stimulate your faith by listening to answers to prayer. And stimulate your faith by reading the Bible. As you get into the Bible, you live in a world in which people talk to God and He talks to them. You live in a real world. It's fact, not fiction. It's not myth. It's not a science textbook, but it's not myth. It's a world in which real people brought their real needs to God, asked Him about them, and had them met. And the more you read your Bible, the more you live in that kind of a world, and the more you will do what the people in the Bible did. Stimulate your faith. Don't try and feel it. Don't try and force it, but stimulate it. And secondly, stretch it from within. Now, I learned this lesson from a French missionary, man in Paris, and I've told you the story before, but he said to me, "David," he said, "never pray outside your faith." And I thought, what on earth does he mean by that? I thought, well, that's silly. God is a God who's able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or even imagine. That's what Paul says in Ephesians 3. "Therefore, thou art coming to a king, large petitions with thee bring." You know that hymn? That's what the problem's been. I said, "What do you mean He's able to do anything?" He said, "Yes, He's able to, and He often will do more than you ask or imagine. But you pray within your faith." He said, "I learned this lesson with my next door neighbor. When they moved in, I put them on my prayer list and I began to pray daily for their conversion." And he said, nothing happened. Nothing happened. And finally he said, "I said to the Lord, why are you not showing me any answer to my prayer? I'm praying daily for my neighbor." And the Lord said, "Because you don't believe it." He said, "But Lord, you can do anything." And the Lord said, "I know I can, but you don't believe it." He said, "But I do, Lord. Anything is possible for you." And the Lord said, "No, you don't. You can't imagine your neighbor as a Christian, can you?" He said, "No, I can't." "See, you don't believe it." All right, he said, "I'll stop praying for his conversion, Lord." "Well, what do I pray?" And the Lord said, "Pray for something you can imagine happening. Pray for something that you can believe will happen." So he prayed that he might have a good conversation with his neighbor, and within a week they'd had a great talk over the garden fence. So then he prayed that he might get into the house next door, which he'd never done. And very shortly after that his neighbor asked him in for coffee. Then he prayed that the neighbor would bring the subject round to religion, and the neighbor said, "Where do you go every Sunday morning?" Then he prayed that he might get the neighbor along to something at church, and the neighbor came. And you see what he was doing? He was stretching his faith from the inside. He was praying within his faith, but stretching it from the inside. And it was growing until finally he said, "Lord, convert my neighbor." And he was converted. You got the message? Don't try and feel your faith. Don't try and force it, but stimulate it by studying answers to prayer, particularly in the Bible. And stretch it from inside by praying within your faith. Much better to pray for something small that you can believe, so that when God replies to your faith will grow that little bit and you'll pray for something more. You see, so often one listens to prayers, "Lord, send revival to Guildford." And I want to stop that person and say, what is in your mind when you pray that prayer? What do you think will happen? And can you see that happening? Would it not be better to start with something you could believe would happen? That you can see happening with the eye of faith, even though it's invisible to you yet. Start within your faith, stretch it from inside. And now I must wind up. I'm going on far too long tonight. I'm going to give you just one other side to faith. Everything I've said so far is subjective, but let's look at the objective side now. The objective side is fatherhood. Fatherhood. You see, faith has to have content. It's got to be faith in. Faith in. And my faith meets his fatherhood. For what is unique to Christian prayer, which you'll find nowhere else in the world, in no other religion, in no other Holy Scriptures, is this. One day, the disciples heard Jesus praying. Now, there were men who'd been brought up to say their prayers. There were men who knew what to say. But when they listened to Jesus pray, that was something different. And when he'd finished, they crowded round and they said, "Lord, teach us to pray." They did not, thank God, say, "Lord, teach us how to pray." They weren't asking for a method. They were saying, "Lord, could you teach us to talk to God like you do? Could you teach us to pray?" And he said, "Yes, I can. When you pray, say, Abba. Abba." And for a Jew, that's a revolution. For anyone, it's incredible. You go to all the people who don't come to church and say they believe in God. You count how many times they use the word Father about him. Not once. Not once. "Oh, I believe in God," they say. "Don't want you to think I don't believe in God." But they don't say the Father, do they? Of course they don't. Because they're not his children. And even the Jewish religion, which came nearer to the truth than any other, which prepared for the truth and was the foundation for it, they were so afraid of taking God's name in vain that to this day they won't pronounce it. And I got a Jewish man in Tiberias in the lounge there just a few weeks ago. I was talking to him and I tried to push him hard on this, and hard as I pushed him, I couldn't get him to do it. I was trying to be sensitive in every other area, but I pushed him on this. I said, "Look, I never know when I'm preaching how to pronounce the name of God. Would you tell me?" He was giving me a Hebrew lesson, and he told me I should say Abraham and Isaac and Eliyahu and Moshe, and I shouldn't say Jesus, I should say Yeshua, and not Messiah but Mashiach and Israel. And he was giving me a Hebrew lesson, so I said, "Right, now how do I pronounce the name of God?" He looked as if I'd slapped him in the face. He said, "I'll tell you the letters." So he told me the 4 letters, which I knew anyway. I said, "Now, how do I say those?" Well, he said, "Jews don't say it." But I said, if they did say it, how would they say it? And I reckon I can prize things out of some people some of the time, but I could not get anything out of him on this one. He said, we sometimes use the word Lord, or we sometimes use just the phrase the name, and we say, "You talk to the name will hear you, and the name will answer you." But he said, "No, I'm not going to say the name. God's too sort of up there." And Jesus walked into that situation and he said, "When you pray, say, Dad." For that's what Abba means. And you know, every party we take to Israel, somebody in that party gets the thrill of hearing that word used. Who was it this time? It was Adrian Seaward. Where were you? Where are you? Wasn't it you? And I remember Adrian's face as he came up to me and he said, "Do you know what just happened? I just heard a child shout, Abba, Abba." Was it a little boy or a little girl? little boy, shouting to his daddy, Abba, Abba, Daddy, Daddy. It's the first word a Jewish boy is taught. And Jesus came and said, look, it's not a method, it's not a technique. I'm not going to give you a ritual. When you pray, say, Abba, Dad. You're his child. And here I'm going to talk about the use of hands in prayer. Because that part of the body is more used in prayer in Scripture than any other part of the body, even more than knees. Most prayer in Scripture is standing. Some is kneeling. All of it is with eyes open. There's nothing in the Bible about shutting your eyes. But the funny thing is that most in the Bible, the most used part of the body in prayer, apart from the mouth, is the hand. And you know, we saw the hand being used as it should by little beggar children, the Mount of Olives. Do you remember?